Well, a warm welcome to today's talk, and it's a bit of a departure. For a few days now, I've been wanting to do something on mental health, and obviously thinking about the current tragedies that are occurring in Europe about Putin. Is this guy sane? Is he mad? Is he rational? Is he irrational? What is he? But of course, I have very limited insight into this. So Vlad Vexler has kindly agreed to come on, who's got more insight than anyone I've talked to on this subject. So, Vlad, a warm welcome to the video.
It's lovely to be with you, John.
Well, you're going to give us an introduction.
Yes, I can introduce us in Russian.
Please do.
Добро пожаловать. Это наш разговор про Владимира Путина, президента России, и разговор про все, что происходит не только в Украине, но и с нашими демократиями здесь, на Западе. So that's a bit of Russian.
Thank you, Vlad. The reason I do that is to point out that Vlad is a native Russian speaker, of course, and you lived in Russia till you were 10, I believe, Vlad, but you've been back and forth quite a few times.
I traveled back. I travel back less now because I struggle with the nature of the government, to be honest. And I spent the 80s in the Soviet Union as a child before the family, together with so many other people who were partly Jewish or Jewish, moved to Israel. So I caught the tail end of the Soviet Union when it was no longer that scary or repressive. But nevertheless, it still had a little bit of the kinetic energy of the propaganda was still there. And so I'm grateful I caught that.
So what we want to do is look into the mind of Putin, really, to see, to answer those questions, really. Are we dealing with psychological phenomena? Are we dealing with psychiatric phenomena? So the background is that Putin is now 69, so he's even older than me. So he's actually getting on quite a bit. Let's just say he worked in East Germany, shall we, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. He became acting president, I believe it was the 31st of December, 1999, and he was like, his first term actually began in the year 2000. Second term, 2004 to 2008. Then, of course, there was the Medvedev interregnum for 4 years when Putin was technically prime minister, although there was ambiguities there, and he's been there ever since. So it's been there for a long time. Now, we're going to put a link to your excellent video, of course, and do check out the insights on Vlad's channel are just completely mind-blowing to me. But the first thing you address, Vlad, about Putin was what worries him. So you think he's largely motivated by worries and concerns. Would you like to tell us what you mean by that?
I think that there are worries, but there are also worries that are kind of bigger than worries, and you might call them traumas. I think that Putin has a very conspiratorial and a very paranoid image of the West. And some of the things that Western countries have done, he finds very objectionable. But some of the things Western countries have done, he is so emotionally impacted by that there's a kind of a level of rawness and sensitivity there that feels extreme and unhealthy. And perhaps the biggest example of this is the intervention in Kosovo at the end of the 1990s. And Putin's trauma there is really about this sense that he has, that we don't share with him, but he certainly has it, that Russia was completely disregarded by other major powers, and that Russia was treated with extraordinary derision and disrespect, because even though it wasn't as great a power as it was in the Soviet period, it wasn't as great a power then. It was a very economically fragile country. Putin felt that there was something absolutely appalling about the country being treated like that. And we don't necessarily have to share his vision, but my God, he feels that a lot. And I think what that shows is that there's at least a big place for us to talk about delusion in Putin, and not just this sort of scheming approach whereby he actually knows everything and has a balanced view about everything, but just simply then contrives and manipulates and so on. So Putin has sort of actual big ideas, actual emotional impacts that he has inherited from recent history. And he is persecuted by these feelings of his, in my view.
Mm-hmm. And how does that relate to his fear of a nuclear strike? And what are his fears of a nuclear strike?
I think that, if anything, it's that he is perhaps not afraid of a nuclear strike enough. I think that some of the things that he has said about nuclear war are less his own views and more pandering to military and security service folks around him. So he is appealing to certain people around him when he says, as he did not very long ago, what is the point of having a world if Russia isn't in the world? And this was in the context of having a conversation about, a worst case scenario nuclear exchange between major powers. So Putin has been talking about nuclear weapons as though they were a tool that he doesn't want to use, but a tool that under extreme circumstances he would be prepared to use. And you might say, well, is there anything wrong with that? I think it's a last resort for anybody. We don't want to think of it as anything else. And I think there is a problem with it. And the problem is that historically we have related to nuclear weapons as almost a political tool rather than an actual weapon. The thought was it would never be used intentionally. And what Putin is doing is starting a conversation where that becomes, yes, an option of last resort, but an option. And I think this changes our landscape, even compared to the hottest moments of the Cold War. As dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis was in the early 1960s, John, I think that there was extreme motivation to avoid World War III at all costs. And I'm not saying that's absent, but I'm saying that sort of firm commitment, this shall never happen, isn't in place in this man or in some of the people around him.
So to you and me and anyone who knows anything about this, nuclear war is completely unthinkable. To him, it is actually thinkable.
It's thinkable in this sense. He wants to keep the chances of it low, but if increasing the chances of a nuclear exchange gets him some other benefits, he is happy to escalate that risk. He does not want to raise that risk to 20%, let's say, to use a silly number that we pluck out of the sky. But if he feels the risk is 1%, he's capable of saying, I'm going to make it 3 and see if that reshapes the international environment in my favor and then react to whatever the consequences are.
So I'm getting the impression here of a gambler, perhaps?
Somebody whose risk tolerance is high, but somebody whose capacity to make micro daily decisions is still stable and non-rash. So this sort of excessive emotionality that we've just mentioned, John, is something that affects his big vision, but he is not going to make a rash decision even in the middle of a war, in my opinion.
So he is a rational man. In day-to-day, pragmatically, he's rational.
A rational man in terms of day-to-day decision-making with arguably highly irrational big ideas.
Got it. That actually makes sense. And one thing that slightly concerns me is that if he's, let's say, paranoid about a nuclear strike, there's this sort of Freudian idea of projection that you tend to see in other people, that which you know to be true of yourself. So if he is worried about the West making a nuclear strike, to me, that would worry me that he himself would consider potentially a nuclear strike. This projection idea, is that fair, or am I over psychologicalizing that?
You're not, because I think that one of the things that's really important to understand about Putin is that there are certain things that you and I take for granted that he doesn't believe are real. One of them is something like the complexity of democratic institutions. So when you and I think about Ukraine potentially stabilizing itself as a democracy, Putin would say, since democracies don't really exist, unless Ukraine is a properly run authoritarian society, a democracy will just mean it's a kind of vassal of the United States. And so some of what we would recognize as procedural caution about escalation in our world, in our democracies, Putin might not see. So it's possible that some of the checks and balances on our behavior in the West are kind of invisible to him. And I think that's something that's worth acknowledging. I mean, one of the things that he really struggles with is, for example, in Russia, to recognize the concept of political opposition. He just believes that there are friends, enemies, and traitors. And if you are a political opponent, you're just an enemy or a traitor. And there isn't really another way of categorizing you. And so when we say, no, Mr. Putin, there is fair competition within shared rules of cooperation, and that's how democratic societies work, he will say, no, deep down somewhere underneath, this is just competition without rules. So you and I are standing there with tennis rackets on the tennis court, and Putin has got a shield and a sword, and we're trying to persuade him, no, Vladimir, you've got to serve into that square, and there are rules here, even though we're trying to beat each other. And I think there is something to this that you might miss features that condition how Western countries behave.
It's almost like a Cold War mentality that there's two camps. And what I'm struggling to understand is why someone as patently intelligent as Putin it seems incapable of any nuance of thought when it comes to these two categories. You're either a friend, or you're an enemy, or you're a traitor. The complete polarization of his thinking there. Why doesn't his intelligence, his obvious intelligence, intervene to correct this?
I think that part of it is generational. I mean, think about it. Imagine that you were a young man just into your adulthood and you make a decision to join the KGB. What would motivate you to do that? What kind of personality would you have to do that? How many kids knock on the door of an organization like that in a country like that? And so I think that there probably was an element of mistrust in human motivations being what they seem to be, that he had from the very beginning. And I think that has escalated with a very long stay in power at the top of a very messy and complicated regime. I mean, this is hard. I mean, you, for example, have got a vast platform with which you're communicating to many people. I'm just using you as a tiny example. But I mean, imagine that your platform grows, and in 10 years, you're still doing this, and you're communicating with a bigger number of people than ever. It's not completely easy to not go potty. I mean, you will use your experience of being in the real world. You will use your experience to, dealing with, the medical welfare of folks in complex parts of the world. That will keep you sane. That will keep you rational. But even running a big YouTube channel can send you a bit potty for many years. If you do this for many years, because you are your own rudder. There's nothing else. You wake up in the morning and you decide, where is this boat going? And eventually you could veer off course unless you keep checking yourself. And this is to be multiplied by 1 million if you're sitting on top, not of a YouTube channel, but of a very complex, very bizarre, amorphous regime. And over and above that, and this is true of Putin, you're not online, you don't go on the internet. Less worryingly, because this is more predictable, he doesn't have a mobile phone, and he receives folders that land on his desk with information from different agencies. I mean, this is a man who is in a position that's a position which would make most of us go a bit potty and lose our monitors to planet Earth. And so that's a factor. But I think from the very beginning, this is a man who was very suspicious of human motivation. And what I think a lot of people who interact with him seem to say is that he overestimates personal motive. So if you are building your YouTube channel, it must be to do with power or money, John.
That's the projection thing again, Vlad, isn't it?
So
if I was doing it, this is why I would do it. Therefore, you're doing it. Therefore, that's why you are doing it.
And I think that you would try to say, well, no, I have certain values. And my values are to do with the importance of public education, about public health, public education about how the body works. And I'm very passionate about this. And this is who I am. And Putin would say, yes, okay, maybe, but... And so there is this sort of corrosive reductiveness in the way he understands the motivation of various political actors.
Is he conspiratorial? Does he actually believe in sort of conspiracy theories, delusional ideas, or has he got people round about him that keep him rooted in reality? I think those two things kind of go together. Is he conspiratorial, first of all?
I think that he isn't conspiratorial in the sense that he thinks that the moon landing didn't happen, but he is conspiratorial in the sense that he's going to see American and NATO influence in places where there isn't much of it. And one of the things that is so strange to Ukrainians is that, yes, they're dealing with a great deal of corruption before this war starts. Yes, they've got many vast economic problems. They've had a very challenging pandemic. But there are Ukrainians who are passionate about running their own country, who are passionate about democracy, who are passionate about having a country where people prosper and some of the worst off people prosper. And when people come out and argue about what is the right path for a democratic Ukraine, Putin just puts this down to external causes. So propaganda from the US State Department, rather than people saying, we want an accountable government because we want our kids to have a better future. And we're Ukrainians and we're proud to be Ukrainians. And we want to live in a country that functions well. And Putin would say, well, no, as soon as these ideas come in, it must be some kind of seeding of State Department propaganda. It must be some American secret services instilling their agents in place and so on. But the irony is there are probably more people engaging in secret agent work for the Russian side in Ukraine than for the American side.
Yeah, and we should say that you've got active contacts in Ukraine and in Russia at the moment. So you have people that you're able to liaise with in lifetime.
And I think on a more trivial note, I am also equally Russian and Ukrainian by blood.
That is interesting. Okay, so interesting, right? Good. And then we're all interrelated, of course. A lot of people in my country come from that part of the world anyway. We migrated here about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, but we all have very common ancestors. Is Putin subject to peer review? So he'll give out an idea, and has he got people, like the British cabinet? There's, at the end of the day that they have a united front, but there is a bit of fisticuffs goes on in the meetings. Is it like that?
There is a tendency, unfortunately, especially with foreign policy, for people to try to guess what he wants and anticipate that. One of the things that we saw on television just a few days ago is this remarkable security gathering he had with folks in his administration, where people were trying to guess his position. He was publicly putting them on the spot. And Putin's chief of intelligence, a guy called Narishkin, was asked by Putin, tell me your stance on Ukraine and tell me your stance on the recognition as independent of these two eastern regions. And the guy got it wrong. He got Putin's position wrong. And Putin pushed him and put him on the spot. He said, so you're saying that you don't accept the independence of these two states? And the man sort of implied that maybe it's premature to do so. And he had to say, no, I will be supporting this. And Putin said, you will be, or you do support? And he said, well, I do support the integration of these two regions into the Russian Federation. And here he tried to guess Putin's position and overshot, because Putin didn't want to absorb these two regions into Russia. And so Putin said, no, we're not talking about that. Let's be clear. Do you accept that these are now independent regions? And the guy said, okay, now I get it. Yes. And the man, 67-year-old man, security chief, was shaking. You can see this on the internet. His lips were quivering. And he was there trying to guess the position that Putin needed him to take.
So this is one of Putin's senior officials.
Unfortunately, I would be concerned about the extent to which Putin can get a sober questioning of where he stands on foreign policy. What the best bet for this happening is that there's going to be so much instability in the Russian elites who are going to be freaking out about the extraordinary economic turbulence and isolation that Russia will be experiencing, that they're going to have to start talking. At the same time, there is also going to be a break on that, because they will be excluded from running away to the West, and they'll know they might be stuck with these siloviki, with these folks from the security agencies and the military, and so they may not want to question them. So I think that at the moment, unfortunately, there's a propensity, this is just my guess, to give Putin stuff that already matches the vision that he has.
So there's this security chief guy that he deliberately put on the spot. He deliberately humiliated him. It almost sounds like that's a sadistic thing to do to such a senior person.
I think certainly there is a place for sadism and there is a place for sociopathy. There is also pragmatism there, because Putin is aware that there is a hypothetical future in which he is responsible for a war crime, and he is dispersing that responsibility.
That's clever.
In public.
Yes, it's clever. Yeah. So interesting. We're not excluding the diagnosis, if you like, of sociopath. That is one of the differential diagnoses we have.
I would be slower to talk about psychopathy, but possibly. But sociopathy is easily on the cards. It's almost impossible to see how you could avoid sociopathy after Putin's reign of 20 years plus.
Sure. So Putin seems to have a fairly opulent personal lifestyle to me. We believe he has a lot of female companionship that's available to him. He's certainly got grandiose residences. He seems to take himself quite seriously in terms of personal spending. Is this just his personal greed, or does he see greater symbolism in these things?
I think the second, John. I think there are people at the top of this regime in Russia who are simply, in a kind of unqualified way, pursuing self-enrichment. I think Putin has developed a kind of sense of mission that's about his place in history. And I think he didn't have it at the beginning. He developed it just before the annexation of Crimea and the intervention in eastern Ukraine about 8 years ago. And so I think that there is this worrying thing going on now, whereby he partly associates his own biography with the collective destiny of the nation. And so there is not a distinction between Putin's palace and the palace that just belongs to a regime that to some extent is resuscitating the greatness and the capacity of gathering foreign lands of the Russian Empire.
So there's almost a conflation in his mind there. He sees himself almost as the state.
I think that's probably more of what's going on than a greedy man who wants to outdo other people's yachts.
Yeah. Now, Putin's not always entirely truthful, is he? What is his attitude to truth, lies? Because he seems to lie about all sorts of things. I mean, a few days ago he was saying we have no intention of invading Ukraine while he was planning to invade Ukraine. I mean, the truth appears to mean nothing to him. But what's your kind of thinking on his attitude to truth? Does he use truth as a pragmatic device, lies as a pragmatic device? What's his attitude to that?
A pragmatic device, and there is a special word that Russian political analysts often use, political technology. And that's exactly how Putin would describe language. Language to him is a political technology. But that means that unlike some politicians we have recently had in our field of vision, Putin knows the difference very well between what's the truth and what's a lie. He's not confused about that. He's not somebody who arguably, like Donald Trump, has dispositional states that blow about in the wind. And it's almost not even true to say that Donald Trump changes his mind. He just has these sort of dispositional states that fall short of the steadiness of a belief. Because if you and I have a belief and we change it every Tuesday, it's not a belief.
Yeah, that's right. And he tends to shoot from the hip, doesn't he? Whatever's in his mind there, bang, that's what you get.
So Putin is sitting there and he's thinking, I'm lying now, and I'm lying for this reason and to this extent.
So he knows exactly what he's doing and he's using it as a device.
I think that's true, except for when it comes to these sort of visionary ideas in which he does believe.
So he's got these core fixed visionary ideas that are accommodated any which way he can.
And they're very, very rigid, to the point that I don't think anybody around him would even contemplate interrogating them, because they know it's a lost cause.
So if we define a delusion is a false belief not held by others of the same race, creed and religion, which is not amenable to rational argument or debate. He is deluded in some of these core areas that others round about him can't even question it, that they have to be assumed as axioms of progress and decision making.
I think that's really fair. I sometimes like to make a distinction between illusion and delusion. For me, illusion is getting the world right, but being wrong about where it could conceivably go. And delusion for me is getting wrong the world that's already here. So, for example, somebody who is a very committed communist revolutionary could actually have a very accurate view of the world as it is, but then be mistaken about these conceivable future stages of development. Putin, unfortunately, has views about the world today that you and I would struggle to defend as reasonable.
Yeah. Is Putin an emotional man? Does he go into rages? So I mean, Hitler, for example, was famous for flying into irrational rages. Does Putin keep it under tabs, or does he fly off the handle a bit and make irrational decisions based on rage and anger, do you think?
I think that he is not somebody who shouts. He's somebody who is fond of bureaucratic language. And one of the fascinating things is that when Putin is involved in potentially criminal activities, he would be using language so diplomatic and so bureaucratically nuanced, it wouldn't even be clear that anything criminal is being discussed or ordered. So he is not somebody who screams and shouts, but where this sort of over-emotionality comes in is when it comes to his vision of himself as a man who is a sort of continuation of the legacy of the more, frankly, repressive Tsars. His hero is a man called Alexander III, who came to power in Russia after the previous very progressive Tsar was assassinated.
What sort of time period, Vlad?
1881. And Putin has erected 2 statues to Alexander II. But again, most Russian historians think that his understanding of this Tsar got very little resemblance to reality, but he genuinely feels inspired by this sort of trans-historical sense of the baton being passed from Alex III to himself. And so this is over-sentimental, over-emotional, and quite frankly, sort of missionary strangeness that is genuinely there. So this is not like a cool apparatchik. This is a man who has these big ideas about historical purposes, and he thinks in a long-term way as a result of this. And one of the thoughts and this is scary to say, in my opinion, he has, is that Russia can get over the sanctions that it will have to deal with in 25 or 30 years. But in the longer historical run, it would have still acquired some territory.
It's interesting in psychiatry when you talk about paranoia, there's really two components to it. One is that you feel people might be attacking you in some way. And the second is that because people are attacking me, I must be really important. Therefore, I must be some religious figure or some secret multi-billionaire or something like that. You're almost describing a counterpart really to the paranoia, which is a grandiosity in his thinking. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and that affects Putin's big vision of the world.
Yeah. Does he trust those around him? Does he trust his generals? Does he trust or who does he trust, if anyone? Is he got a mistrusting nature?
He trusts information that he can double check and verify. But that doesn't mean that he has access to the best information. Let me just give you an example that might be shocking, that I have borrowed from a man who has ongoing interactions with Putin, even though he runs an oppositional media, a man who is called Alexei Venediktov, and he runs a platform called Echo Moscow. And Alexei Venediktov was asked just a few hours ago, what would Putin do if you showed him images of Ukrainians stopping tanks just with their arms, coming out onto the street and interfering in the progress of these Russian tanks. And this man, who knows Putin reasonably well, said he would almost certainly think this is a fake.
Right.
He would almost certainly think that this is a theatrical installation organized by the United States. And that is extraordinary, because while you and I cannot verify these images, their overwhelming plausibility would make it just so strange for us to give them that interpretation. Because what are you going to do when tanks are invading your homeland and your military is outgunned? You would do that.
That is kind of delusional, really. So he takes something which is obviously true and cognitively distorts it to fit in with his underlying presuppositions and beliefs.
And I think that one of the tragedies for Ukraine is that if there is a sort of locus for Putin's irrationality, it focuses on that poor country. That Putin's most irrational ideas are to do with what Ukraine is and what is happening in Ukraine and who is externally influencing and manipulating Ukraine.
And Belarus, is he happy with that because it's basically a like-minded dictator in charge of it? Because, I mean, we're talking about two former Soviet republics there, aren't we? Why is he not so interested in Belarus?
He is interested in Belarus, and he is concerned about the potential fall from power of Lukashenko, because that will create a great deal of uncertainty. One of the things that worries him that isn't spoken about is actually democracy on Russia's border. So it's not just these countries joining a foreign alliance that's an enemy of Russia as Putin perceives it. You and I might experience these countries as running away from Russia and gaining security. Putin experiences them as being co-opted by an alien military alliance. But that's not his only worry. His other worry is democracy. Because if there is democracy in Belarus, if there is democracy in Ukraine, might there not be democracy in Russia? Might this not consolidate that kind of confidence in his country too? He is concerned about that, and partly because he doesn't think democracy is everything it pretends to be. For him, democracy is this sort of very dangerous way of exposing a country to foreign interference. So he is absolutely preoccupied with Ukraine and Belarus. He's preoccupied with Ukraine more because it happens to be now drifting westwards.
So he's got this ongoing desire for power, and he sees this as a threat to his personal power. Is this move of Ukraine towards the West almost like a personal threat to him?
I think that it's a personal threat because he is worried about Western attempts to facilitate regime change in Russia. Right. The idea of what, and he wasn't a great fan of Saddam Hussein, but the idea that what happened to Saddam Hussein could happen to others, or what happened to Gaddafi, is very, very disturbing to Putin indeed. Whether he's desperate to stay in power, I think, is a separate question. I think it's closer to being the case that he sees no way of leaving safely.
Yeah, he's almost trapped, isn't he? Because if he steps down, then whoever takes over and does have power could do whatever they wanted with him, such as hand him over to The Hague for trial, for example.
With the financial resources of everybody around him, and of course with his safety and with his welfare. And he hasn't developed any procedural institutions to facilitate a transit of power. And so one thing we can be certain about is that the transit of power from Putin to whoever comes next will be something that happens to Putin. It will not be something he controls.
There's no succession planning.
Succession for Putin will be something that is a series of uncontrollable events, with which he is just a sort of victim.
I'm interested by his attitude to the internet. I mean, personally, I'm completely addicted to the internet. I'm not particularly good at it, but I have the desire to find out what the latest thing is all the time. I mean, as far as you understand it, does Putin actually never go online personally? Unlike Donald Trump,
I'm sure he has been, but just speaking hypothetically, if this video were to go viral, and we are being very mean to Putin in this video, what would happen is that he would get screenshots of it printed out.
He wouldn't actually watch it himself.
He probably would not be given a screen even to see it.
He'll get a piece of it or a summary of it from his.
Yeah, he'll get a screenshot and he'll be told, well, there's this guy called John Campbell. You never know.
Yeah, I'm not too worried as long as you're safe. That would be the only thing that would concern me. What is his English like?
Rudimentary.
Right, because we believe he speaks English, but he doesn't speak it in public.
He would understand the majority of our conversation, but not all of it.
Okay, right. And of course, we're very impressed by Boris speaking in Russian. Did you catch Boris Johnson speaking in Russian the other day?
I'm afraid I didn't, but I think I have actually heard him try to say something in Russian on the previous occasion.
I'd be very interested to know how good his Russian was from a native speaker, so you can maybe let us know in the comments about that.
I will assess it and let you know.
Please do, yeah. So political opposition, if people are political opponents, he doesn't have this nuance that there is legitimate diversification of opinion. He would tend to automatically see them as traitors. Is that what seems to be coming out from this?
Well, traitors if they were once on his side and abandoned ship, or just enemies if they never were. And enemies is a much more preferable tag for him, because you can be at least sort of straightforwardly respected for that. I think that he doesn't believe in there being such a thing as opposition. And when we talk of opposition here in the West, he would think that this is a kind of facade and a kind of fabrication, and people are either pulling the strings of a kind of play that if we looked beyond the surface of this play, we would see that there really isn't any meaningful opposition, or we would see that the opposition would sort of descend into people just being enemies if the opportunities for that existed. So he basically just doesn't believe that it's a stable way of running a society, having opposition.
So he actually believes he's right all the time.
He believes that when you and I are now potentially worried about the welfare of our democracies, when we're looking at how divisive our societies are. He believes that what we are worried about losing is something we never had in the first place.
Yeah. So I think we've concluded is pragmatic. We've concluded it is dogmatic. How does this interfere with his flexibility of thought? So, for example, if the invasion in Ukraine ground to a complete halt, he was sustaining heavy losses, which, of course, with Western weaponry is more than possible. Would he be able to adapt to that situation and withdraw, or has he got this flexibility of thought that can allow him to respond to a new sort of real situation on the ground?
I think that he is not so mad as to not understand that things are going very badly with this invasion so far, and that their sort of quote unquote blitzkrieg technique failed. And he is realizing that Russian military are now stuck on Ukrainian territory without the facilities to operate there properly. They're running out of fuel, they're running out of food. Ukrainian citizens are reporting Russian soldiers asking to be fed while holding up machine guns. Putin is not going to be uninformed about this, but if he has two lanes, one is de-escalation and one is escalation, he is likely to escalate.
So that is concerning. His natural predisposition would be to escalate and start using heavier grade weapons that could kill people in basements, and pretty terrifying ideas we'd rather not think about. That is a possibility.
It's a worry for us because Russia's economy is weak and getting weaker, and Russia's capacity to do something in response to the sanctions that it's being hit by is limited. And so one of the obvious tools to pull is this tool where you begin waving about nuclear warheads. Even if you're not serious about using them, just this act of waving about these warheads normalizes something that we want to sort of keep off the table of possibility.
As if it's part of everyday discussion. Oh, we could have nuclear war. That's a little bit frightening. One of the things that I've noticed about Putin over the years is, for example, he met George Bush the second, I think it was, and George Bush II said something like, "Well, I looked into his eyes and I saw a genuine something or other." And he seemed to Tony Blair, like I think Tony Blair said something like, "He's a man we can do business with." He seems to, when people have a personal meeting with him, they actually seem to come away thinking, "Oh, this guy's not too bad." Is this a manipulative technique he has? Is there a mimicry that he's using, that he kind of pretends to be what people want it to be, that he reads the situation so well, is able to be the kind of guy that you want him to be in that situation, and people end up with a positive view after the meeting, which transpires is not related to reality at all? Is this part of his technique?
I think it is, and I don't know if this is something that's a natural gift of his or if he learned it in the KGB. It's hard to observe this well because he doesn't speak English, but in Russia he has shown historically an almost freakish ability to speak to people on their terms. And you can see through this, but it takes a lot of effort because he does masquerade it well. He is somebody who could be flagrantly violating human rights in a certain context while speaking like he is a human rights campaigner. He is able to do that. At the same time, I do think that when it comes to the international stage, his vision has such an emotional hold over him that maybe now he is no longer capable of charming and disabusing people of skepticism. My personal feeling is that when Macron spoke to Putin for all of these hours, his experience would be, this guy is a bit nuts, because he spoke to me for 5 hours about how he's being encircled, and that's a bit nutty. So I do think that there are limits to this mimicry, unfortunately, or fortunately, because Putin is no longer able to contain himself when it comes to these key international issues that have got a hold over him, that to us just seems completely crazy, because there's virtually no account of Russia's national interest that is compatible with a brutal invasion of its neighboring state.
That would be an interesting question for Tony Blair or George Bush, wouldn't it, if they were in fact conned, as it were, by Putin or not? But historians can answer that. Can answer that question. Now, there's another contradiction here. He likes this, and of course, Putin did a degree in law, didn't he? He's actually legally qualified in law. So he's got this sort of due process, using the system, going through A, B, C, D, E, not doing shortcuts, and yet Putin's enemies tend to end up in the graveyards. How? There's a contradiction here. I don't even know how to ask the question. Did you understand? There's kind of this contradiction here.
To anybody who's an outsider, it just looks like Putin's enemies often disappear, and we presume that he has something to do with that. That's the impression we get from the outside. I think that the picture is more complex, and that's to say that some of these tragedies, which are in fact political murders, are let's use the word allegedly on YouTube, are allegedly connected with things that Putin intended and requested, and some of them are most plausibly not. So the reason that yesterday was a special day in Russia was because it was the anniversary of the assassination of this politician who was shot outside the Kremlin, called Boris Nemtsov. And
2015.
We don't know exactly what happened, but the preponderance of opinion, and that's also the opinion of Boris Nemtsov's own family, is that while the folks who executed this crime were caught, the people who organized it weren't, and the people who ordered it weren't, and the investigation was obstructed to deliberately leave them untouched. But the preponderance of opinion holds that this political murder may have been organized by powers in Chechnya and not run through Putin. So this might be an example of an enemy of Putin being assassinated without Putin's involvement. We don't know the truth. At the same time, we know to a high degree of certainty that in the poisoning of the Russian opposition leader who is currently in prison, Alexei Navalny, there is overwhelming evidence of top-down involvement. But in answer to your question, when Putin allegedly does have this kind of involvement with these political murders, he would be using language that's far removed from let's get this person taken out. The language he would use would be something like the relevant agencies extending the realm of reasonable measures to address some of our key security issues. And I think that that's not just a kind of fakeness, that's somehow part of Putin's personality, that even when a court case is basically just couriered and constructed by him, he still talks about the court needing to make its own decision in good time. He has this legalistic way of speaking, and I think he thinks that's a healthy way for a regime to be publicly seen, to be communicating. But it's quite extraordinary how he can basically be involved in setting the length of a sentence the court gives, which is what's happened with Alexei Navalny. He's getting 15 years from a top-down order, but Putin would still be talking about it as though there was some autonomous institution running through its own due process. And he is not doing this on camera. He will do this even in private. This is a very strange trait, but it's important not to buy into it.
It's almost like a plausible deniability, isn't it?
It's a plausible deniability, but it's also the sense that institutions work effectively when they are seen to be something they're not. So he thinks that to maintain the perceived legitimacy, and there isn't much of it, of the Russian legal system, we need to talk in procedural terms, as though there are checks and balances, even though they're not at all there.
Things like the Salisbury poisoning, where they used Novichok, and the poisoning, I forget the chap's name, where they used the polonium. Who was that?
Litvinenko, 2006.
Litvinenko, yes. So Novichok and polonium, the polonium being the radioactive one, the Novichok being the nerve agent. You can't buy these from the corner shop. These are obviously state agents. It's almost like he was deliberately saying, look, this is a state-sponsored act, and if you mess with me, this is what you're going to get. Do you think there's truth in that?
I think that there is truth in that, but there is also truth in the idea that some of our agencies could sometimes act autonomously, and you never know what they're going to do, and that might be even more scary.
And they would actually be stupid enough to use something with a fingerprint like polonium or Novichok, potentially.
I think that one of the interesting questions that remains unsettled about the more recent event, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, it might be that they were keen to use this method of trying to have a go at Alexei Navalny, because they weren't 100% interested in killing Navalny. They were interested in poisoning him with a view to one of several things happening: death, lifelong disability, or recovery, but a message really coming through. So it's possible that the method used was more important than the outcome obtained. This is certainly the theory of the Russian dissident Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is based in the UK. That's been his speculation about this situation. And in ethical terms, it kind of even feels uglier to us. You're almost indifferent as to whether a man dies.
So whether Navalny survived, disabled, never mind, we've sent the message.
And we'll be able to deal with the consequences. We'll pick up the pieces wherever they fall. It's quite extraordinary.
Putin's clearly intelligent. Would you classify him as a competent leader in any way? Is he good at what he does?
I think that Putin, as we've already said, puts a big premium on having a kind of sense of cultural moments of moment coming and going, and a sense of historical evolution. And the trouble is that he is a total amateur when it comes to understanding history. His understanding of his own heroes is full of demonstrable falsehoods. So this is not like Barack Obama, whether you like him or not, who is capable of writing very articulately about, a stage that the culture is at, and where it's come from and where it's going. So this is a big weakness for Putin. He is not rational here simply because he has got these big visions, but he doesn't have anything more than a kind of retired KGB agent's amateur hobby relationship with history.
He's a hobby historian.
He's a hobby historian. And then the other problem is that the Russian state is, unlike the Chinese state, very highly dysfunctional. And so there are simply limits on what you can do. And you saw this very much with the pandemic, where the pandemic policies were left roughly to local regions, and Putin just deliberately stood back, didn't even take a clear position on the vaccines, and left the show to be run in different ways, in different places. And I think a lot of analysts would say he actually couldn't have implemented a coherent nationwide policy because there isn't a functional bureaucracy to make this work the way there clearly is, whatever else we say about this horrifically repressive regime, there clearly is in China. Like the Chinese can do a vertical implementation of a program. Russia can't. And so that limits Putin. He feels like he is a man treading water in domestic policy, as opposed to a man swimming somewhere. So what he ends up doing is controlling the informational environment more than actually making any reforms.
Yes, he controls the information rather than actual what is on the ground sometimes. It's so it's sort of a chaotic system almost in some respects.
It's a system that I suppose to Putin often feels like you can turn the wheel, but nothing happens.
Yeah, that must be a source of great frustration to him, isn't it?
That's a source of frustration. His feeling that he can't leave power safely is a source of frustration. His paranoia about being encircled is a source of frustration.
So, Ukraine. What's his philosophy about Ukraine? Is it a sentimental attachment that this is a return to our historic destiny, or is it simply territorial? What is it?
Vladimir Putin has said and written that Ukraine, together with Belarus, are part of Russia for him. But I think that there is a risk in overestimating his sentimental attachment to Ukraine, because the word that people who have had interactions with Putin report him using about Ukraine is territory. And Putin thinks that he's engaged in some kind of a proxy conflict with the United States on territory that should rightfully belong to him. He sees the president of the Ukraine as somebody who should in fact be a local governor, who has, by a series of bizarre historical accidents, become a president of a country. And it's not so much that there is this extraordinary sisterly love between Russia and Ukraine such that they can never be apart. It's more that this territory is trying to call the shots when in fact it should be a local governorship that's accountable to Moscow, and that is used on our terms as a buffer against perceived threats we experience coming to us from the West. So that's, I think, how he sees the Ukraine. But I do think there is then this kind of large-scale historical vision, which is that whatever anybody does today, by 2300, by 2400, Ukraine will return to Russia. And that's the kind of inevitable, almost teleological historical momentum. So there is this both pragmatism about it being territory where you have a conflict with powers you perceive are your foes, and this historical vision about it.
It's actually quite chilling to think that he would use a whole country as a pragmatic device in the short term, but based on this long-term, almost predisposed, predetermined future of the commonality of the countries.
If Vladimir Putin has a philosophy of international relations, the philosophy is that great powers should control different regions of the world, and that sort of oversight is the best bet we've got for guaranteeing stability.
That's interesting. That's one of these core things where we're talking about that the world should be divided almost into power blocks, and preferably his power block should be as influential as possible. Vlad, that is an insight that I have never had in my entire life. Thank you so much for that. Now, a lot of us obviously will put, if you want the definitive version from this, go to Vlad's channel. It really is quite mind-blowing to listen to he's able to develop Vlad's able to develop his thoughts much more clearly without me intervening all the time. And do watch that. But pragmatically, Vlad, what can we do now? I mean, I feel a desire to do something. Millions of people feel a desire to do something. How can you advise us to we just want to get rid of this frustration of watching this on TV. What can we do practically?
Well, I think this is why I'm so grateful to you, John, for this conversation, because it gives an opportunity for us to support people to take some possibly constructive action. I think there are two things we can think about, and I think the right thing to do would be to put some links underneath this video to give people the possibility to take some action. The first thing to do is really quite obvious, and that's to support humanitarian organizations in Ukraine. And I think there are 2 or 3 possibilities we're going to drop in the video description that you'll drop in the video description.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pleased you're advising us on the best ones as well, because you actually know that situation.
And I think that the other approach sounds kind of counterintuitive, but here is why it makes sense. The other approach is to actually support independent media in Russia that are pushing the Russian population to open their eyes against the war.
Yes.
And the reason that's so important is that a lot of people would argue that the Russian regime can't too strongly go against the set will of its citizens. At the moment, its citizens are still in the dark about the war. It's only a small segment of the Russian population that understands what's happening. And there are some independent media that are risking their necks by showing everything. And what's very important is that they have already been designated as foreign agents. So if we support them, we're not going to harm them that way, because they've already been put on this blacklist. But nevertheless, they are doing the work of showing Russians the truth, both pictorially and analytically, by bringing on people from the Ukraine and just letting them share what's going on. We need to open the eyes of folks in Russia to this, so that the regime feels a bit of pressure. Let's not forget, probably 1 in 4, if not more, Russians is very closely tied to the Ukraine, either by having a very close Ukrainian relative, or by themselves being from the Ukraine. So this sort of connectedness at the level of family bonds is quite extraordinary. And when Russians properly recognize that the entire country is under bombardment, there is some possibility for movement, even among people who aren't ordinarily opposed to this illegitimate regime.
And you're right, you can tell us the legitimate free media in Russia, because I wouldn't know the difference between the legitimate free media and the... So again, your insight there is greatly appreciated, Vlad.
We're going to do that, yeah.
Yep. Well, I've kept you talking for over an hour, so thank you very much. It's a big chunk of your day. We really appreciate it. I'm curious to see how this goes down. I mean, to me, this is about understanding what's going on, and that allows us to have a better chance of predicting the way you'll jump next. And from what you've said, I'm now actually slightly more anxious than I was at the start of this conversation, that he'd probably use heavier grade weapons, and there could be a lot more bloodshed, and that he's unlikely to do a complete reversal of his course at the moment, which is brilliant, because we're now better appraised of the likely outcome, but pretty terrifying at the same time.
I apologize for that, but I do
we want to know the truth. We want reality.
I do think that daylight makes us safer, rather than looking at things without seeing everything that's there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, maybe just close. What are your personal feelings? I mean, you must be terribly, you've got Russian and Ukrainian blood, as you've said. I mean, this must be really traumatizing for you personally. I mean, don't answer that if you don't want to.
No, I would love to. I don't think it's traumatizing, but I am 40 years old, and I have been politically curious all of my life, and I have never felt as much political emotion as I have felt in the last 3 or 4 days. And that's because, even though I've been a UK citizen and not a citizen of any other country for a quarter of a century, but because I grew up in the Soviet Union in the 80s, because even though Ukraine and Russia are different countries and different peoples, they are so similar that I have the feeling that I have a 2% responsibility for what's happening, and that we are seeing essentially Putin bombing his own people. I don't want to push that too far, because Ukraine is a separate people to Russia, but this really feels as horrendous as two American states involved in the conflict where one of them is bombing the other. And it's very, very difficult to obviously change what's happening, but the level of emotion I feel, and I'm a philosopher, I'm not somebody who goes on the barricades. You could listen to me talk for an hour, you wouldn't know who I'd vote for. But I feel a level of emotion against this Russian regime that I can't articulate on social media without endangering your channel.
I think that communicates really quite enough, Vlad. Thank you for sharing that. We appreciate that.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you so much, John.
Right, if you want to, Vlad's going to read the comments. Tell us what you think. And my meeting, I did actually plan a meeting with Vlad round about now, where we were going to discuss aspects of philosophy, particularly Nietzsche, who I know absolutely nothing about. So when the pandemic things died down, I wanted to get into this. So hopefully Vlad will be doing that at some point in the not too distant future. When
Thank you so much. I'll be very engaged in the comments, and I will be answering people's questions and concerns.
And we'll get all those links. We'll make sure all the links are right, and anyone who feels the need to follow that up, please do so. Vlad, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.